Hey everybody, welcome back. In this video series, I'm working on building a 3D SimCity clone using Three.js. Right now I'm showing a high-speed preview of what we'll be implementing in this video. We'll be building out a basic toolbar, and then we're going to hook up those buttons so we can place zones and roads on our game map. There's a lot of work we need to do, so let's get to it. So diving into placing buildings, what do we need to do that? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to add some buttons on the left-hand side of the screen here. So we need some kind of user interface so I can select different tools. Let's say I want to place residential buildings or commercial buildings. Maybe I want to bulldoze an existing building. So I'm going to build out a toolbar on the left-hand side here. Let's go into our index.html file. Within our render target div here, I want to create a new div that will hold our toolbar. So I'm going to give that an ID of UI toolbar. Then within here, to start with, I'm just going to have a bunch of buttons. And I'm going to have 5 different buttons. I'm going to have bulldoze, residential, commercial, industrial, and roads. I'm going to quickly fast forward and build those out, and then I'll show you the CSS for that. Okay, so we have the HTML for our buttons, and you can see we have the 5 different types that I mentioned before. You'll also notice I have a class on each one called UI button, and the bulldoze one has an extra class called selected. So we'll use this to highlight the selected button or the selected tool. So I've made some changes to the CSS. I'm not going to run through those changes since this is really just a temporary UI. But you can see I have some styling for our toolbar, some styling for the buttons. When the button is selected, I give it a different background color, and I change the hover color if I'm hovering over an unselected button. So if you go back and look at the UI, this is what we have now. The selection isn't quite working yet because we're not changing the selected class for each button. So the next thing that we need to do is actually have our buttons do something. So each button corresponds to a tool. So when we select that button, we want to select that tool. So in order to get that functionality working, we need to go into our game class, and I'm going to create a new variable called ActiveToolID. This is just going to be a string, and I want to create a new method on my game object called setActiveToolID. Pass in a tool ID. And we'll just set the active tool ID to that. We've exported that function so we can access it from our index.html file. So now when we click on a button, we need a way of setting that active tool ID. So I'm going to add an additional method onto our window called setActiveTool. This will pass in a mouse event and our tool ID. We want to change which button is selected based on which one is clicked. Let's keep track of the currently selected control up here. And let's just start with our bulldoze button. Scroll up a bit here so we can see our buttons. So I set our bulldoze button to be the first selected button. So we'll initialize our selected control to be that element. Just getting that by its ID. So in our setActiveTool function, we'll check to see if there currently is a selected control. And if there is, then we will remove the selected class from its class list. We're going to update our selected control to the target of the event, which will be the thing that we just clicked on. And then we need to add the selected class to our newly selected control. And then finally, we want to set the active tool ID on our game. Now, in order to actually make this method execute, we need to add an onClick event handler to each of our buttons. I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've updated all of the buttons to have onClick event handlers. So let's run through how this works. So for my bulldoze button, I have my onClick event. So when I click on that, it will call setActiveTool. So this is in the context of the window. So it'll call this method down here. So it'll pass in the event data for the click, and then it'll pass in the tool ID. So I've just assigned an arbitrary string here, but I've just called it bulldoze, residential, commercial, industrial, and road. Just very clear and simple what the tools IDs correspond to. So I'm just going to call this method here, pass in the event data in the tool ID. We'll change whether the button is selected or not by removing or adding the selected class. And then we're going to call the setActiveToolID method on our game object, which is attached to our window, which we've done up here when the window loads. So in my game, it's going to call the setActiveToolID method here. It's going to update the ActiveToolID for our game object, and we're going to log that to the console. Let's go to the browser and see what that looks like. If I click on bulldoze, we'll see that it prints it to console here. And this is coming from line 37 in our game, which is right here as we expected. And if I click on residential, commercial, industrial, road, you can see that all of our different buttons are triggering that setToolID method in our game. So to round this out, let's update our onObjectSelected event handler. I'm just going to delete these old console log statements for now. So if our ActiveToolID is bulldoze, want to remove existing building. Otherwise, if our tile does not currently have a building, then you want to place building at that location. So one of the things we need to do is to update our assets. So right now we just have grass, building 1, building 2, building 3. So we need to have some assets or 3D models that correspond to a residential building, commercial, industrial, and a road. So I'm going to go ahead and build those out, and then I'll show you the changes that I've made. Okay, so the changes aren't too dramatic here. You can see that I've removed the old building 1, building 2, building 3 assets, and replaced them with residential, commercial, industrial, and road. Another thing that you'll notice is that the buildings are all now static height, so they don't change based on what level they are. We'll add that back in later, but for now, these will just be static placeholders. I've also updated the ID of each mesh so that it corresponds to the name of the asset itself. And I've also added a road, which is basically just a cube, but I've squashed the height down a little bit. So it looks a bit flatter and more like a road. So there we now have our assets for our different objects. Let's save that and go back into our game. So to place a building at a location, all I need to do is update the building ID of that tile. And then I need to call the update method on our scene. And that will go through each tile on the map, look for any changes in building ID. If it sees a change, it will replace the building at that location. So similarly for the bulldoze tool, all we're going to do is clear the building ID at that location. We'll just set it to undefined. And then we will also update the scene. So some other housekeeping changes I'll need to make. If you go into our city file here, this update method is no longer relevant. Our buildings are no longer growing. So let's just go ahead and make that an empty method body right now. Let's try placing some zones on our game map. The residential buildings appear to be working. Let's try commercial. Those are working as well. And industrial also works. And finally, let's try some roads. And those work as well. All right, perfect. Our object placement is working. So let's try removing objects. Looks like it is complaining about asset ID being undefined, line 57. So it looks like it's trying to create an asset instance with no asset ID. I'm going to go into our scene file. So we're calling that method when we're creating the grass. And then we're also calling it here during our update method. So it looks like I'm not checking to see if the new building ID is undefined or not. So I'll add an additional check here, just a null check to make sure that, if there is no building ID, then we're not trying to remove it. Let's go back to our map. I'll lay down some zones again. Then we'll go ahead and delete them. And there we no longer get that error message. All right, so that about wraps it up for this video. We built out a basic UI that allows us to select different tools. Then we can select those tools and we can place zones and roads on our game map. So in the next video, we're going to be making our buildings dynamic once more so our city grows over time. And if you're enjoying this video series, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. That encourages me to keep making new videos. So until next time, take care, everyone.